Hey everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eve Sanderson, and I'm the Executive Director of NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. For those who aren't familiar with our work, we're an academic research institute that studies how the online information environment impacts politics, policy, and democracy. And we do so through the production of rigorous academic research, translating this research for other stakeholders, and teaching and mentoring the next generation of scholars and practitioners. We're thrilled to be co-sponsoring today's event with the Center for News, Technology, and Innovation, a research center that seeks to encourage independent, sustainable media, maintain an open internet, and foster informed public policy conversations. So we're here today to tackle an issue that both of our organizations are trying to understand: the rapidly evolving information landscape and its profound impact on trust, democracy, and our shared understanding of reality. In recent years, the internet and social media have led to an unprecedented transformation in how information is created, shared, and consumed. At the same time, we've seen a troubling trend: a broad decline in trust, not just in government institutions, but also in science, expertise, and the media. This problem has many and different overlapping causes, which we certainly won't solve today, including rising polarization and declining civic participation, but many place blame on our increasingly siloed and partisan media environment, trends that intersect with the rise of algorithmic social media platforms and recent advances in generative AI. Today is my favorite type of panel to moderate. I've gotten to invite four of my favorite thinkers and writers from across academia, civil society, and media to discuss a topic that I'm passionate about. My hope for this conversation is that we can be both descriptive and prescriptive, to both deepen our understanding of the problem and start to think through possible solutions. My hope is also to do minimal moderating and have our brilliant panelists be able to discuss amongst themselves. As a brief run of show, I'm going to introduce each panelist just before they talk and give them roughly 5 to 7 minutes to talk about their work. After our four panelists have gotten a chance to do this, I'll ask a few follow-up questions and open it up to the audience. If you have questions throughout this webinar, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll get to it probably around sort of 12:30, 12:35. So to kick things off, we're going to start with Amy Mitchell, who's the founding executive director of the Center for News, Technology, and Innovation, our wonderful co-sponsor for today's panel. Prior to her role at CNTI, Amy served as managing director of news and information research at the Pew Research Center, where she worked for 25 years. Amy, thanks so much for joining us today. And conversations about media and trust have to be grounded in research and evidence. It's something that sort of connects our two organizations and your work at Pew. To start, I was hoping that you could share what sort of research is telling us about this decline in trust in the information ecosystem, how the political environment and technology have sort of shaped those trends, and ultimately what drove you to launch CNTI.
Thanks so much, Evan. And it's terrific to be a co-sponsor. So CNTI is very pleased to be able to be doing this with such a great group of folks. I think first I'd say that trust is made up of many components. It's a simple word, but what actually makes up trust and leads to people's answer to that sort of singular question around trust or lack of trust has many elements, including things like distrust and antipathy and exhaustion and being pulled in many different directions, all of which have been changing over time as well. And these emotions are often affected by many different environmental conditions. And I'd say if we're looking at the US specifically, we have beyond a trifecta of conditions that we're dealing with here. The digital expansion brought an explosion of creators, an explosion of choice, new forms of media, much of which has been greatly beneficial in terms of enhancing people's ability to get informed. It also brings a confidence to question sources that maybe weren't questioned in the past. It brings greater public voice. It brings greater involvement and a sense of authority among the public, which we've seen alongside with that is a general push against institutional elitist authority, a sense that I have a voice and I can question things as well. The extreme pace of technological development has made it hard to keep up with the way news and information flows today, whether you're a creator, a distributor, a consumer, and then to figure out how do we separate various kinds of content? How can one of the things that happened in this digital environment is that news was harder to differentiate from other kinds of content, and journalism certainly as a part of news, even harder in many ways to differentiate. And in the US, and particularly with our two-party system also, which does play a role, we have just awful levels of political animosity, alongside the ability to self-sort in almost all aspects of society today, whether it's the news you're getting, the places you live, where you go to get your coffee. With a two-party system, we're often one or the other. And so that increases in many ways the kind of animosity that can be felt. And then we bring in the disinformation element, which, whether politically motivated or otherwise, it's infused so much of the text-based content and is now spread into visuals and, infiltrating information channels at a very rapid pace. So how does whether it's due to political animosity, public strata, sensationalism, part of an actual concern, but lack of time to confirm the kind of news and facts that need to get out during important times, let alone regular times. How do we approach putting up guardrails and trying to deal with the challenges of that space, while also thinking about how to strengthen the journalism ecosystem as a whole? And that's what I would say I would lean on most heavily when we think about, how can we be thinking about the best ways to address this challenging balancing act in many ways of where we are today? How do we help the public, or at least the part of the public that is seeking to have factual information and to find and know what is trustworthy? To borrow a line from a piece we have coming out soon that comes out of a series of focus groups we did in 4 countries over the summer, much of the public is actively creating their passive news environment. So as the public looks to do this, they're looking to get news and information that they're interested in, along with some discovery, when they need it, in a style and language that they relate to, with a sense of connection to both the person providing it and the content itself, and to be using technology that enables, technology does enable today, the public to find and create these spaces for themselves. So it's important that we, those of us who are trying to think about a more holistic, sustainable, functioning ecosystem of news and information, to think about the ways to be sure journalism and fact-based reporting is a part of that larger digital space. How can we enable this functioning, sustainable environment and an informed public? One of the things we've also done is, first question is to think more fully, to understand, how does the public think about journalism and news today? Insights, again, from these focus groups, there's a pretty consistent understanding of the distinction of journalism from news, in that journalism is mission-driven, it's more thorough, it takes a holistic approach, and the public, at least a good section of it, values it. For some things, not everything, which is important for us to all understand as well. It's not always about journalism. Sometimes it's just getting the information I need. But many do not see institutions as important providers of that, and indeed see them as potentially being a part of the problem. So then the question of when we ask about who can and does produce journalism, that's where there's a lot of sort of hesitation and, oh, well, it's the journalist, but well, it could be this person I follow too on YouTube, or it could be, et cetera. And so I think there's a real gap there in thinking about journalism and an understanding of who can be providers of journalism that I can trust. And so as we think about the ways to help communicate and distinguish journalism to the public, I'd say there are a few different things to keep in mind. One is, first and foremost, creating and then communicating relevance. That's one of CNTI's priority issues, amid all these other things that are algorithmic transparency and addressing disinformation and how do we deal with AI in journalism. Relevance matters for any of that to have an impact in terms of how we address it. Continuing to encourage innovation and diversity in the creation of journalism that meets the public's needs and interest is a critical component. Being sure that journalists can do their work safely and independently. And that's both in terms of security and independent from governments and independence from other kinds of influencers, as well as being sure it truly is independent. The public has a pretty strong sense of when there's something else going on that maybe isn't keeping that news straightforward and without any personal element to that. Finding ways to distinguish journalism from other forms of content, I think remains a really critical part of our digital news environment that we've not really ever fully addressed. I think we've recognized it, but we haven't figured out a way to do that. And then doing all this at the same time that we work to create guardrails against the harmful, ill-intended information. So ultimately, I'd say that we need to keep front and center that none of these issues at the intersection of journalism and technology, whether it's trust or any of these others, are in a vacuum, that they all interrelate. And a part of the larger information ecosystem is being able to think deeply about how those connections happen and to really seek to create that kind of sustainability and functionality in our systems. And, is really a part of what is at the foundation of CNTI.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy. I think right now in my own work, one of the things I'm getting really interested in that I think dovetails nicely with with some of your observations is the number of creators on TikTok who are largely just sort of parroting the work of journalists, and this tension between, on the one hand, that hurting the business model of news organizations, while on the other, increasing the impact and the sort of audience that it's reaching. And so I think a lot of these sort of trust impact audience and business models all sort of are intertwined in really interesting ways, especially on new platforms. So next we're gonna go to Indira Lakshmanan, who is currently the Ideas and Opinion Editor at U.S. News and World Report and a member of the PBS Editorial Standards Committee. An award-winning editor, columnist, and correspondent in Washington, D.C. for the last 16 years, Indira's career has taken her to more than 80 countries across 6 continents, where she has reported for print, digital, and broadcast media. Indira, I'm really happy that for you to be here today, and it's great to meet you via Zoom. During your sort of illustrious career in the media industry, you were also the first Newmark Chair in Journalism Ethics at the Poynter Institute, where you focused sort of on restoring trust in journalism, amongst other things. Based off of sort of this work, both at the Poynter Institute and also your work as a journalist, how do you view the sort of decline in trust of media, especially in this political and technological environment?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of such an amazing panel. Everyone on this panel is so expert in their area of research, so I'm really honored to be part of it. I was really fortunate to be the first Newmark Chair at Poynter at a time in early 2017 when with then President Donald Trump blowing up this whole notion, spreading this thing of the media as fake news. It was really sort of an inflection point, I would say, where trust in traditional media really began to take a particular hit and was falling for all sorts of reasons for political polarization. I mean, we know that there is a structural backdrop to all of the reasons for the decline in trust in news. And, Amy Mitchell in her past job at Pew and Jay Rosen in his job at NYU have done tons of foundational work on this. But just, the quick line summary is, of course, that there was a time in the 1950s and 60s and even 70s where everybody was watching 3 nightly newscasts and having a sort of agreed upon idea and understanding of these are the facts and this is the news, whatever their opinions might be about it. We know that with the 1990s and the takeoff of cable news and the rise of right-wing talk radio in particular, there was a sort of sudden polarization that took place, where you had the rise of Fox News, the rise of Rush Limbaugh. This has been well studied and written about, with the sort of the changes that came about from the FCC under Reagan, with the end of the Fairness Act, so that you were no longer required to sort of give all sides. I think the outcome of this now that we've seen in the last 20 years is, as digital media has grown, traditional media has shrunk. Half of all US adults now get their news, at least in part, from social media, according to the latest Pew Research studies. And we all know that Facebook, Instagram, Google have sucked up all those advertising dollars that used to go to traditional newspapers and magazines. Their revenue is now 1/5 of what it was less than 20 years ago. And all those platforms are deprioritizing news. So I think a lot of people out there who aren't specifically out there looking for news, they're not finding it because it's also not being offered. And younger audiences are tending to gravitate towards podcasts and Instagram video stories, as you had said, and Amy was saying as well. There's certainly one advantage to influencers and Instagram content creators talking about the news. It reaches a whole new audience. The problem is, are they talking about it in a way and with the same values that journalists have, and the same kinds of fact-checking standards? And that has been a real concern of mine, that as we see a rise in going to non-traditional sources of information, there's a decline in trust in the news. And part of it is that people no longer trust the media to accurately report the news. And part of this is because of the rise in opinion journalism not being distinguished from news journalism. Now, as someone who is proudly now running an opinion section, we are very clear to mark everything that we do as commentary. Our section is listed as an ideas and opinions page. When I was a columnist myself, for 3 years for the Boston Globe and for 2 years for Bloomberg and the International Herald Tribune, it was funny because sometimes I would get angry reader emails. Well, why are you so opinionated about this or that? And I, wanted to say, well, in this case, opinion is a feature, not a bug. I'm actually an opinion columnist, and it's marked that way. I've always felt it's incredibly important for news and media sources to make very clear what is news and what is opinion, but particularly in the cable news sphere, having talking heads and pundits yell at each other and talk is just much cheaper than producing reported content from the field. And so we have a rise on television of a lot of people giving their commentary, which is not distinguished from news. So I think it's hard for ordinary viewers who aren't in the news business themselves to distinguish between what is news and opinion. Part of, what I said before about then President Trump, using the term fake news and conflating that with what truly was fake news, which were false headlines. Throughout 2016, our friend Craig Silverman has done amazing work where, dating all the way back to 2016, he was able to do that incredibly detailed report when he was at BuzzFeed, showing that the number of fake news headlines that were shared on social media, specifically on Facebook, were shared 1.3 million times more and had 1.3 million pieces of engagement more, not times more, 1.3 million more pieces of engagement than real news headlines from legitimate news organizations. So all of this gets confused when there is real fake news and there is real pink slime. Those sites, there are now more than 1,200 pink slime sites across America, by which I mean sites that are not real news. They are either backed by foreign entities, Russian influence operations, Iranian influence operations, or by partisan organizations in the US, and they pose as being local news sources, but they really aren't. So the latest studies have shown that there are now more pink slime operations out there than there are legitimate local news outlets, which is incredibly troubling, because what we've seen over the last 20 years is, as the public's trust in media, particularly national media, has dropped, trust in local media still remained pretty solid. That's no longer the case. And particularly when you have a rise in pink slime sites, that means that people can't distinguish anymore, is this real local news or not? What I found incredibly frightening was a recent Gallup poll that found that 4 in 10 Americans now say they have no confidence in news reporting, and only 32% have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence. And think about 21 years ago, in 2003, when Gallup asked the same question, only 1 in 10 people expressed no confidence in the news. So if you're talking about almost half of the US population having no confidence in the news, this is a huge problem for us. Of course, this is partly rooted in the shutdown of some 3,000 newspapers since 2005. The fact that newspaper circulation in America was at a high in 1984, 85, and it's now down to less than a third of what it was at that time. We have news deserts all over America. Hundreds of counties where there's literally no real local news provider. And I see a rising divide between a small subset of voters who are, say, elites, educated, who are heavy news consumers, and the vast majority who are not interested, or even news avoiders, because they find news depressing, no solutions. So let me just say briefly something about some solutions. One of these, I think, is the approach of solutions journalism, trying to report very hard-nosed on the news and what the problems are, but also presenting places where things are working and where those models can be replicated. Another thing is obviously doing much, much more to educate ourselves in news literacy, educate our children, or nonprofits like the Solutions Journalism Network are doing that, and the News Literacy Project is, of course, working on news literacy in K through 12 schools around the country. So, those are some initial thoughts, and AI is only making it worse, obviously, because now even a child can give a few simple instructions to a generative AI program and create fake news, create things, even videos that look like they're real when they're not. And we all know that, content providers are very aware that shock and sensation drive engagement, and engagement is what all these platforms want. And so that is a disincentive for news that is serious and isn't necessarily shocking or sensationalist. So we have a lot of problems. And I think that I'm glad that the term fake news is not thrown around as much as it was in 2016 and 2017. But I think part of the problem is that there is less and less trust of the news than there was even then, even 8 years ago.
Yeah, thanks so much, Indira. One of the interesting things I've found in classes recently sort of relates to what you mentioned between opinion and news, which is, my research largely focuses on mis and disinformation. And now I found in the classroom, many students want to talk about media bias. And a few years ago, that was a very different conversation that tended to happen in classrooms. And so I just want to sort of plant a flag for Q&A. That's something that I would like to come back to for you, Indira, but all of the panelists. So next we're going to be turning to Brandi Collins-Dexter. Brandi, it's great to see you. Brandi is a media fellow at the UCLA Center on Race and Digital Justice. And if folks aren't familiar with that center on this call, I encourage people to look into it. It's an incredible center doing incredible work. I'll drop in the URL later in this panel. Brandi has experience across communications, policy research, writing, and advocacy, and her work works to ensure heightened levels of corporate, government, tech, and media accountability are in service of human and civil rights. Brandi, I'm really happy you're coming into this sort of conversation at this point, because this conversation so far has grappled with the complex interplay between the sort of supply side of news, the media industry and journalists producing it, and at times influencers. And the demand side, the communities consuming news. And a lot of your work sort of does an incredible job sitting at this next how trust and consumption of news intersects with various sort of individual level and community level sort of factors such as education, geography, race, gender. So based on your work, I was wondering whether you could discuss the relationship between the sort of the communities consuming news and the news that is or often isn't being produced, and how that might impact trust.
Yes, thank you again for having me with this panel. So I want to make 4 points when it comes to the issue of mistrust in media across different demographics. And that is, I want to push back a little bit on the idea that this is a newer phenomenon or a byproduct of the internet era. Not saying anyone here is particularly saying that, but that is a kind of common talking point that we're often debating these issues around. And the truth is that the mistrust of media is not a new phenomenon and stems from the underrepresentation and misrepresentation of certain communities. I think about this in the context of the Kerner Commission in 1968, which was a congressional committee created by President Lyndon Johnson after several uprisings and riots in urban communities across different cities like Chicago, Detroit, and others. In 1968, the commission warned that our nation was moving toward 2 societies, one Black and one white, separate and unequal, and that the media needed to accept and correct its unfortunate role in exacerbating that schism. And that was said then. And I think that's still to a certain extent, to a large extent, true now. There's always been this deep distrust. Black media was built post-Civil War, in part because legacy media had a role in gatekeeping the story of a nation that excludes the truths of those most silenced. We saw an emergence in the 60s and 70s of a lot of independently owned and controlled media across a number of different communities, feminist literature, literature in a number of different languages, because those needs weren't being served by the papers of record. And that remains true in a lot of ways today. So I say all of that to say that, like, when we kind of get into this conversation around distrust of media, it often ignores that history. It ignores root causes, ignores the fact that, like, certain groups have had reasons then and now to distrust media. It's still a lot of ways a work in progress. And that once you've kind of broken down that trust, it can be hard to build it back up, which reminds me of, Pew obviously has gotten a lot of mentions here, has done a lot of, deep research around, for example, Black distrust of media, and has found that roughly half of Black Americans, 52%, say the news and media in the US was designed to hold Black people back a great deal or fair amount. And so again, that's something that's like has to be in the mix when we're talking about these issues. The second point I wanted to make here is that as you see the kind of like mass consolidation of media, which has been going on for decades now, and increased layoffs from certain beats, that can accelerate a sort of mistrust or a loss of places to go for people to obtain local media that speaks to their interests, media where they feel like their story is being told not just to them or about them, but with them and with people and journalists that often reflect some of the experiences that they feel. And I was thinking about this particularly because I was in Chicago this past weekend doing an event around the history of Black media and the loss of Black space and place. And we talked about the kind of golden age of Black media in the 60s and 80s. And just in Chicago alone, in that period of time, you had 6 in operation Black newspapers serving the community. You had 5 Black-owned radio stations. And that's something that you don't see anymore. You don't even have a lot of control over your local news. You don't even know what's happening with your local high school team. And so I think, often when we see that loss of kind of, again, space and place, and when you see the kind of like beats being, when you see the mass layoffs that are happening in journalism, and a disproportionate number of them are happening with people that are doing kind of quote unquote race beats, people from different demographics, people of a certain age, that means, again, you're kind of creating a gap in terms of whether or not the people that folks see reporting on the news, they feel actually are accurately going to represent their interests. And that's not even to speak of the fact of the ways in which paywalls can kind of limit access. And what we have online then is people often talking about content without actually even seeing the original news article. And so you might take, for example, a New York Times article and it gets debated online, but it's behind a paywall so nobody can see it. So they're kind of dissecting the headline, or it's a lot of people sort of jumping in and editorializing what they think it says, but you can't even necessarily directly access it without paying a certain amount. So that like sort of restriction to access is another way that can both accelerate trust and divide people from being able to see what the article says versus the editorializing around the content. And then the final point that I'll make is that, one of the things that we see that in some ways has always been true, but is particularly now, is that the relationship is more fluid than people sort of consuming news and the organizations producing that. We've already, you've spoken to this and several people have talked about this, but it's kind of like the evolution of the new ways in which people are understanding news. They're still wanting, looking, and longing for news, but there's been a kind of TMZ-ification of political content that in a way offers new incentives, new opportunities to monetize different aspects. And it pairs with this kind of like news avoidance and people not really trusting journalism and the algorithms kind of giving people what they want, and political content that's often sensational and identity based in a way that like kind of pulls us away from some of the basic aspects of what we want to know about our news and political content. So I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Brandi. And a quick reminder for folks on Zoom to put any questions in Q&A in the Q&A box after Jay. We'll move over to Q&A. So Jay, it's great to see you and meet you on Zoom, even though I think you're just down the street from us here at CSMAP. Jay Rosen has been teaching journalism at NYU since 1986. As a press critic and reviewer, he has published in The Nation, Columbia Journalism Review, The Chronicle of Higher Education, The New York Times, and many other publications. And Jay, you've written a lot about coverage of politics and how the news coverage mediates the relationship between media organizations and audiences. And last year, you've urged newsrooms to cover the stakes of the election, not the odds or the horse race. And we're a month or less than a month out from the election, which still sort of sends a shudder through myself. And so I'm curious how you would describe how journalists have covered previous elections, how they're covering this election, and how you think it sort of impacts trust in the sort of political and election related news people consume.
I'll try to answer that question and then also add some other difficulties to the portrait of the landscape that we already have, which is full of difficulties. On how well the press is done, my 5,000 feet up conclusion is, where it was possible to report this election using traditional tools of campaign journalism, I think the American press has done a pretty good job. Where it was necessary to come up with new practices or to face novel challenges with coverage that might be without precedent, I think that the American press has done a weaker job. So if it fit into the traditional boundaries of campaign coverage, good job. And I think the coverage of what I called the stakes, not the odds, but the stakes was the way I put this point. There has been some really great stakes coverage when all it required was the will and the time to report on something that was somewhat knowable, especially with Project 2015, extremely knowable. So that's my general conclusion on that. I want to make a couple other points about trust that are perhaps obvious, but need to be examined anyway. Steve Bannon and his podcast are trusted. The problem is not trust in that case, it's finding content that is trustworthy and trusted. So I know this is incredibly obvious, but sometimes we forget that what the kinds of news and news coverage that people trust may be the problem. The problem is not necessarily generating trust, it's the distribution of it to practices and to people and to institutions that are not trustworthy. Um, Also, another thing we have to understand is that destroying trust in institutions is going on nonstop during this campaign, and it's not some kind of accident or some sort of unintended consequence. It's a deliberate strategy that is completely coherent with political strategy. So I've tried to illustrate this by making a distinction and coming up with my own sort of vocabulary for it, which begins with the term, foreign term, but useful one, of verification in reverse. This is what I see the Trump movement and Trump himself as engaged in, verification in reverse. And what I mean by that is verification is a core practice in journalism. It is very basic to how good journalists do their job. It means asking in a very simple way, did that really happen? And then finding the documents, the witnesses, the experts, the people who were there, and the public record to mobilize all of that and to get an answer. Did that really happen? Yes, here's how we know. Verification is the heart and soul of journalism as a public practice. But Trump and his movement have excelled at a different thing, which I would call verification in reverse, where you take something that has been nailed down and you introduce doubt about it. And introducing doubt about something well known to be verified has results, and the results are commotion and emotion and controversy and denunciation and anger and ridicule. And you can take all of those reactions and power your political movement for it. So this is something that Trump has been expert at since 2015, really, when he discovered birther politics as potent politics. And so sometimes I think we see decline in trust as sort of an accident or the result of another practice or an unfortunate trend that we don't understand very well. But in many ways, creating mistrust in democratic institutions is a way of doing politics and a way of trying to win. And I think sometimes we slight that. Um, Finally, what I'm trying to do uh, for my part in contributing to solutions is to remind people that there is an alternative to traditional campaign coverage out there that's been available since the 1990s, pre-internet. And I have tried to get as many newsrooms as possible to give it a try. And it's called the Citizens Agenda approach to campaign coverage, which starts in a different place rather than beginning with the candidates or their strategy or the parties. Instead, you start with the people you are trying to inform, the voters, the readers you're addressing. And you begin not by asking who's ahead, who's likely to win, what are their strategies, but instead by asking the people you're trying to inform a simple, but I think very potent question, which is, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? What do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? And if you can ask enough people that question, what happens is that certain priorities the voters have bubble up from below, and you begin to see patterns and definite statements emerging from your effort to ask people, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? And you can take those patterns and fashion them into a kind of agenda, and that agenda can then become the approach you take in your news reporting. And if you can add good information to what you know are priorities of the voters, you can then take those two things to the candidates and get the candidates to address the issues and problems that you know the voters care about, because you ask the voters that you can reach with your newsroom. And this approach, which began, as I said, pre-internet in the mid-1990s, is a different way of doing campaign coverage that I think also addresses the collapse in trust. And that's what I mean by trying different approaches and perhaps inventing new practices. We're at the point where some of these problems that we've talked about already are really out of control, in the sense that they're way beyond what we're used to dealing with in scale. And I'll just leave it there for now. But what I said at the top was, where journalists could use the tools that they have always used for campaign coverage, they did a pretty good job in this election. Where this election required them to come up with new practices and maybe even make new institutions, they haven't done as well.
Thanks so much, Jay. So we're going to turn to Q&A. I see a couple questions in Q&A. A reminder to folks in the audience to drop any questions you have into Q&A. Also for our panelists, if you have questions for each other, please feel free to unmute and jump in. I'm going to take both the moderator's prerogative and also the prerogative today being my birthday to ask the first question, which is, I want to ask actually each of you, not to solve the problem, but instead to focus on one of your favorite sort of solutions. And this can be a new research idea or project, an organization that you think is doing incredible work that you'd like to call out, that is really working on trying to rebuild trust. I think this dovetails really nicely, Jay, with what you sort of ended with rethinking the way that we shape election news coverage. I'll add one more thing, Amy, before I go to you to give you a chance to sort of think about your answer, which is that there was Claire Wardle, who's now at Cornell, previously at Brown, did a great project in South Florida where she attempted to do exactly, Jay, what you mentioned, where rather than trying to sort of just debunk misinformation, she started by asking community leaders what were the questions in their communities that they were hearing unanswered. And how can we first answer those questions to try to sort of, attack the information environment before sort of skepticism and confusion spreads, because we know that's an information environment that is ripe for misinformation to spread. So I'll sort of call out that project and drop in a link to it as I turn things over to Amy, and we'll just go in the order of which folks spoke. Amy, what's your sort of favorite solution, research area, other organization, or your own organization sort of working in this space on solutions?
Yeah, well, happy birthday first. That's awesome. Glad that you're spending some of it with us. I think I have to say two things. I have to say one, a bit of, the orientation of CNTI, I think is really, as we think about solutions, is to think holistically, to think about this as a system, to think about journalism and news as a part of the information space. And it's going to remain just a part. And how do we think about the whole of this? I think Brandi's point about lack of trust is not new. It's just being heard today because it can be expressed, and there are ways and choices and avenues. I'm second going to cheat a little bit and respond to a question I saw in the chat as an example, because I do think it's an interesting example of an institution that has rebuilt itself, thought creatively, to your point, Jay, about, what are the new ways of answering the needs of the public, and that is libraries. They are playing a really interesting role today, and in many communities have really rebuilt themselves to be both a place where people come together, a place where people can get some of that New York Times content, to your example, Brandi, and to be a place where they're doing all kinds of things. They're much more than books today. And in many cases, they're the internet providers in parts of the country that need it. So that is an example. It's not exactly in the line of area you were asking, but I do think it's a call out that the person in the chat made, which is worthy of notice. And I've raised libraries' ability to additionally use their buildings. If a part of what is holding, financially some certain news institutions is the structures that they're paying for, libraries have thought about ways to use their institutions in ways to serve publics as their needs have changed.
Thanks so much, Amy. Indira.
Hi, so happy birthday as well. You're going to get lots of birthdays wishes today. So I already called out two of the groups who I think are doing great work. One is the Solutions Journalism Network, which is a nonprofit that was founded by two journalists. So they're easy to find online. And I think that they do a lot of really important work rebuilding trust in news by being transparent about the news they do and making it people-centered, making it centered on the audiences, something that Jay was talking about, the idea of rather than covering the horse race and who's up and who's down and what's so-and-so's plan and someone else's plan, they start more with communities and audiences and what do they need and what do they want, and go from there. So I'm a fan of SJN, and they have a terrific online story tracker, a curated database of rigorous journalism that involves replicable solutions. The other one I mentioned was the News Literacy Project. And full disclosure, I was on the initial advisory board of Solutions Journalism Network, and I'm on the journalism advisory board of News Literacy Project. But I think that's why I know more about what they do. And they do really important work educating kids about news literacy and teaching, and a lot of, again, another nonprofit with a lot of free tools that are available to anybody online, Checkology, and ways to check media bias, but also just what to understand what is news, and to make yourself aware of misinformation and disinformation, train yourself away from it. So I think that's a good one. I also am a big fan of Joy Mayer and the Trust Project. And she does a lot of really important, trusting news, rather, sorry. A friend of ours, Sally, actually does the Trust Project. And both of them, deserve a lot of credit for the work that they do with labeling. Joy Mayer, her project is another nonprofit that works directly between journalists and communities. And I think that the points that Brandi made were very important about why disenfranchised and marginalized communities have not had trust in mainstream media. Those are all extremely important points. And part of what Joy and Trusting News are trying to do is engage communities. And there are a lot of other nonprofits who are part of the larger network, and who are getting support from Newmark Philanthropies, who are working on some of these same issues. And I also would recommend the work of the journalist Amanda Ripley, who has done some really interesting work on polarization and how to bring communities together to really listen to and hear each other, active listening through your journalism. So she has, written a lot of articles and done a lot of work on this. So I would also recommend Amanda Ripley.
Thanks so much. And for folks in the audience, in addition to sending a recording of this panel, we'll also make sure to send a list of all of the resources and folks doing great work that are mentioned here, so no one has to has to take notes. Brandi,
As the daughter of a librarian, I have to echo what Amy and one of the audience members said about public libraries. I am the proud daughter of a librarian, and I do think that they do incredible work and should be a great gathering place for all of us to get reliable, trustworthy information.
Yeah, absolutely. Brandi, you next.
Yeah, happy birthday. Honestly, I hate to be that person, but I feel like you guys do a lot of really interesting research at the Center for Social Media and Politics. And I know we've had some different conversations about the research, so I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't kind of like name that. I think some other folks that I definitely look to is Catherine Peters. I believe she's over at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life and has done a lot of really interesting research around like community groups and trust building and news. Professor Danielle K. Brown at Michigan State University has done a lot of stuff around like in community trust building and what that looks like, particularly in Black and working class communities. And so I think those are some of the different folks that I certainly look to. And I always get excited when I see kind of a new local paper pop up, and there's like a number that I have appreciated. I live in Baltimore, so Baltimore Beat has been, a welcome addition to what has been essentially in a lot of ways a kind of Sinclair dominated news ecosystem here, as well as some of the work of Baltimore Banner coming from Chicago Tribe, and a number of other publications there are doing incredible work. And Casey Defender in Kansas City has done some incredible reporting as well. So I think finding out solutions that help us really nurture an abundant local news ecosystem. That's the kind of work that I find myself really drawn to, whether that's in the antitrust realm, whether that's some of the journalism bills that are coming up the pike. But I feel like that's really crucial work that we have to be doing.
Thanks, Brandi. Jay, your sort of your comments sort of kick this off. I want to go back to you to see if you have anything to add, and then I think we have time for one more question where I'll try to do a good job consolidating a few of the great questions I see in Q&A.
Well, I want to nominate for public attention a very modest form of campaign journalism, which is also one of the most, in some ways, the most valuable to voters, which is the voter's guide. Almost every newsroom has one where you put the candidates across the top of your piece of paper and the key issues and problems down the side. And then you try and fill in each rectangle with what each candidate said about all of the issues that you know are on people's minds. And that simple information device is frequently said by voters to be the most useful thing they found in all of the campaign communications that they absorbed. And the voter's guide fits perfectly into the citizens' agenda approach that I described earlier, because where do the issues that you're using to make your voter's guide come from? Well, they should come from asking people, what do you want the candidates to talk about as they compete for votes? So it's sort of like the final touch. You create an extremely valuable, although very humble product as part of your sort of cumulative effect of your campaign coverage. Finally, at the other opposite end of the political system, a good practice that I think has been adopted by one of the most visible journalists in the country, George Stephanopoulos, is to simply ask each guest on his show who won the election in 2020. And if they can't give the answer that is an actually factual answer, then it's sort of like game over at that point. I think that was a good move on his part. He doesn't do it as regularly as perhaps he should, but it was still a change in practice that met the moment, in my opinion.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to try to do I'm going to try to combine a few questions, and sort of focus here on the trust people place in themselves to navigate the information environment. So I wrote recently a piece with a couple co-authors in the Columbia Journalism Review about how the decline in sort of the public's trust in news organizations has aligned with people's trust in their ability to sort of search for information, to do what Jay referred to as sort of verification reversed, which obviously can be weaponized by certain political figures, but also is something that the public just sort of engages in broadly. Some of our research suggests that this might not be a particularly effective strategy, and so a few people in chat have focused on content moderation on social media platforms as being potentially part of the solution set. I'm curious for the panelists here, if whether it's in front of classrooms or Indira, you mentioned working on sort of media literacy and digital literacy interventions. How would you sort of engage the public around how they should approach being able to sort of sort of come across and trust high quality information? Is it going to Google and is it doing their own research? Is it simply finding news organizations that they can that they can trust? How do we sort of drive trust in those news organizations? So I'm curious, when it comes to sort of an individual or community centered approach, how can we help people sort of who are trusting themselves to navigate the information environment do that better, knowing that content moderation probably is going to be part of the solution, but on social media platforms, but certainly an insufficient one. And I'll just sort of kick it to the group, and we can go to the hour.
Well, I'll kick it off. I don't know that there's it's hard. And I think people bring different levels of knowledge and sort of comfort with technology and being able to do that, and in interest, to be perfectly honest, in really finding it. One of the things, again, we did this series of focus groups in 4 countries: US, Australia, Brazil, South Africa. And we have a piece coming out shortly. We've just done little insight pieces. The main quantitative surveys in those 4 countries are actually coming out of the field as we speak. So there'll be a lot more data on this. But one of the things was pretty interesting to hear about, which was the ways that people are using technology in very nuanced ways to serve the different kinds of needs they have when it comes to getting information. So that sounds like a lot, but one, as I was saying, is sort of actively creating this passive news environment. But then knowing when, in something about like, well, when you need to know if something's true or not, like, what do you do? Like, how do you go about do that, or do you do it? And it's, oh, well, that's when actually I go to, so I use the YouTube channel I follow to sort of figure things out. And then, ooh, if something's really important, I put it in, say, Google search, and I see the mix of things that come up. And that gives me a sense of, one, is that same sort of story being told by many? Which ones can I look at? So there are certain segments of the public that are thinking about what are the different ways to use the mix of media that's around me, including some that's outside of the web space, to figure out what to think about something. And a part of what we could learn potentially is as researchers to get more knowledge about what that is, right? How do people go about this in their day? What seems to be working and what doesn't? And then creating ways for more people to be able to follow those same kind of behaviors.
I want to be cognizant of time. We are at the hour. If anyone else, any of the other, no, that was, I gave you like 90 seconds, Amy. So if anyone else had anything they wanted to add, I want to give you the opportunity now. Otherwise, we'll wrap up.
Well, I'll add a dire note, which is the media system we have was not designed to create human understanding. It is designed to create new content every day. And to a degree, what we're struggling with in conversations like that is sort of the leftover problems of that fact. The media system isn't designed to create human understanding. It's designed to create more content every day. We're living in the shadow, sort of that enormous problem.
Yeah, that is a dire note for a sunny Wednesday in New York, Jay. But I hope that everyone here enjoyed the conversation about the various real problems here. But I'm very happy that we also got to focus a lot on solutions and sort of call out some of the other folks in this sort of big tent community of people who are thinking about these issues. And for folks in the audience, we'll share both the recording of this panel as well as the resources that were mentioned here. And I finally want to once again thank our brilliant and esteemed panelists for joining us today. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Thank you all.
Thank
Take care.
you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.